Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over the Jig Blender template. This is a simplified version of the Blender platform that we've created in order to just focus on the tools that we use to optimize our 3D models in order to bring them into the Jig workshop. Now, in order for you to easily access these tools, if you go to the description of our video, you should be able to access this link here. And if you follow that link and jump into the Blender template link, that will take you to a Google Drive folder where we have access to the latest version of the Blender template, as well as a guide and a 3D model that you can use inside of the Blender template in order to experiment and follow along with our class today. So to start off with, I'm going to open up my 3D model file. So I'm going to import my FBX. And you can see we have our 3D model in the scene. As far as navigating around this space goes, the controls are very similar to other CAD programs. You just need to press and hold the middle mouse button or scroll wheel, and that will allow you to rotate your scene. If you press and hold the shift button while performing that action, you're able to pan yourself around the scene, and you can zoom in and zoom out using the scroll wheel. Now, as well as being able to interact with your model in this 3D space here, we also have the object outliner on the left-hand side. So I'm going to open this up a bit further. And not only are we able to interact with the individual meshes that make up our overall 3D object file, we're also able to access an object's hierarchy. So if I open these drop-down menus here, you can see we have a fairly complex level of hierarchies going on here. And if I select some of these pieces in our scene, you can see that this allows us to perform complex rotations, not only inside of Blender, but also inside of the Jig workshop. Now you can see our 3D model has loaded into the scene. You'll also see as I move around that we have this grid running along the floor of our scene. And our 3D model is currently sitting below that floor level. So what I'd like to do is select my 3D model. In order to do that, I can use our buttons that are found inside of the JigSpace menu, and I can select all objects. Another thing I could do is press A in order to select all. So we do support hotkeys inside of the Jig Blender template. Now what I'd like to do is lift up my model and position it so it's sitting just on top of this floor here. Now I can do this by clicking and dragging on this gizmo. I'm able to move my 3D model using the Move tool, rotate my 3D model using the Rotate tool, and scale my 3D model. But we also have this multi-tool available, so I could click and drag on that blue arrow to try and position my model right above that floor here. But another way you could go about doing this is by jumping into our Object Transform tools. And what I'm going to do is place this model above the ground. You'll also see that we have this warning here that our objects don't have a uniform scale. So what I'm also going to do is apply that scale to my model. That's just going to make sure we have consistency with how our tools are working. So I'll place that model above the ground, and you can see that it's performed that positioning automatically. It's directly above that floor, so this just means that when you're viewing this model in augmented reality, it's always going to be loading up on the surface the way you would expect. As a quick size guide, we have this little infographic sitting on our floor here. This is 2 meters squared, and each of these squares that you see that make up the floor of our scene is also 1 meter squared. And this gives you an idea of how true scale is going to appear when you're actually viewing this model in augmented reality. So what we're going to focus on next is the optimization process of our 3D files. So in the left-hand corner, you can see we have some statistics available. Now we also have these available inside of the Jig target in our Jig menu. Now what we're focusing on here are the triangle count and the object count. And you can see we have this little warning advising us to reduce the number of objects in the scene. Now, as well as having these counts, we also have access to a number of different devices. Now, some of these older iPhones are going to be a lot less powerful than something like an iPad Pro that contains the M4 chip. So if I were to select this, you can see that we now have no warnings available. And this will give you an idea of how your 3D models are going to run in augmented reality when you're viewing them inside of your Jig. So what I advise doing is always selecting the weakest of the devices, which is the iPhone 10 and 11, and using this as the basis for optimizing your 3D model. Now, we generally recommend keeping the triangle count below 500,000 and keeping the object count below 100, maybe around the 50 mark. But these are very conservative estimates to make sure that you're able to load a number of these 3D models into your Jig scene and still have it download and run smoothly on your device, no matter what device you're viewing it on. So in most cases you can go higher, but we do recommend going as low as possible without losing any visual fidelity, just in order to make sure that everything's going to run as smoothly as possible. Now, what we're going to be tackling first here is the number of objects in our scene. Now, I am aware that we have quite a bit of detail down in these bolts here. Each of those is an individual piece. So what I'd like to do is select some of these upper components and I'll hide those so that I can focus on the bolts at the bottom. Now, we could click on these objects one at a time while holding Shift in order to multi-select, but I'm also able to click and drag, just making sure that we have the select box selected. I'm able to click and drag, and just easily with those selected, I'll go to my object visibility menu inside of the Jig menu, and I'm going to hide my selected objects. I'll do the same for some of these lower base pieces. And this is just going to allow me to focus on just those pieces that I would like to group together. So now that we just have those bolts visible, what I'm going to do next is select all of my objects. I'm then going to go to our mesh menu, and in here I'm able to join those. And when I hit that, it's going to join those all together as a single object. Now, if I press Ctrl Z just to undo that, you can see that we currently have 110 objects selected. And when I hit join, that's becoming 1. So this has significantly lowered the amount of objects that I have in my scene. Now, once I show all and bring back those models that I hid, once I hit A just to select everything and bring back our menu, you can see in our object target, we have 29 objects in the scene, and it's just going to make a significant difference in how our Jig is going to run. Now, when joining these objects together, one thing to keep in mind is how these are going to be used within the scene. Now, I'm aware that I'm not going to be pulling these bolts or screws apart, but if I were planning to pull those apart, I might need to consider how I'd want them to move. Now, just as a quick example, I'll zoom in on this bolt here. If I ever want to separate an object that I joined together, all I need to do is press Tab to go from object mode into the mesh edit mode. And then if I hover over any of these pieces and then press L on my keyboard, that's going to allow me to select linked. And with that selected, I can then choose to select my part and I can separate that part. So now when I press Tab, going back to the normal menu, I'm able to move around that individual piece that I separated out. So what you need to consider when joining these objects together is how you want them to move. If I ever want to separate those lower pieces from the upper pieces and have them animate into position on top of these little spaces, it's worth noting that they'll need to be separate in order to perform that animation. Once objects are joined together, outside of the Jig workshop, they can't then be separated inside of the workshop. So you need to prepare the model inside of this Blender template here. And once you've finalized how those models are going to work, then you load them into the Jig workshop. Now, it's also worth noting that we can only have a single material applied to any joined object. So currently, because all of these bolts are joined together, they're only going to support one material for that group. If I wanted certain bolts to be highlighted as potentially having damage, I may want to, again, pressing Tab, and I'll use L to select these pieces here, and I could separate those. And this would mean that I'd be able to apply a different color and material to that object inside of the workshop, and I'd also be able to pull it away and potentially replace it with a fresh one inside of my Jig scene. So it is important to decide how you want these things to be moving inside of the Blender template. So once I've optimized the number of objects we have in our scene, what I'd like to address next is the number of triangles. Now, when I describe triangles, what I mean is a wireframe mesh that makes up this overall shape. We can jump into the Objects Mesh menu, and here we have the ability to turn on an object's wireframe. Now, if I zoom in on this object, you can see how this model is made up of triangles. You can also see that we have more detail around curves that provide that extra detail, for example, these smooth angles. And what we're trying to do here is lower our triangle count as much as possible while still retaining the overall visual fidelity of our 3D models. So I'm going to hide our wireframe now, and I'm going to be focusing on this piece here. I've prepared this earlier, and just as a quick example, this particular model actually contains probably the most triangles of any model in the scene, to get an idea of how many triangles, you can look up in the top left corner, and the model I currently have selected represents the first set of numbers at the front of each of these different categories. So this individual piece that I have selected makes up 106,000 of the overall 196,000 model. So this single piece represents more than half of the triangles currently present in our scene. So what I'd like to do is lower that count. Now, to get a better look at this, I'm going to hide everything but this object. So I'll go to Object Visibility, I'll hide all unselected, and this will just allow me to focus just on this piece. So what I'm going to do next is open up our Optimize menu. Now, it is worth noting, we have the ability to merge vertices. Now, with some 3D programs, you may find that certain step files or other BREP 3D models don't always have their vertices fully merged. And to give you an idea of vertices, if I select my model and go into edit mode, you can see currently this model is made up of that mesh of triangles, but if I press 1 on my keyboard, that's going to bring up my vertice menu. And each of these dots represents a joining point where those triangles meet. Now, if these vertices aren't merged, it can make the overall model a little bit more heavy, so it is a good idea to just give this a click and see if it makes any difference. Sometimes it'll have no effect, sometimes it will. In this case, once I've done that, I'm ready to optimize my active mesh. So I've already clicked this and opened up my Decimate menu. And what I like to do here is start off by setting this to 0.1. You'll see why in just a moment. Now, when I've done this, I am getting some visual feedback. This is because we have our lighting information baked into our 3D model. Now, in order for me to fix this, I can choose to shade and smooth up our sharp edges. I can then choose to mark sharp angles. In this case, I might set this to 30. And finally, if I right-click this model and set Auto Smooth on, you can see that we now have that nice smooth surface again. This is just making sure that all of our lighting information is no longer being drawn from the original CAD application that was baking this on. We're now using the real-time Blender template scene that we have our model in currently. So it's not relying on old information, it's going to be relying on new information as we make these Decimate changes. Now, in order for me to check our wireframe, what I'm going to do is show wireframe, and this allows us to see the most up-to-date wireframe. This has all of that Decimate information applied. So you're actually able to compare the two wireframes. If I press Tab to enter edit mode, you can see how the original wireframe looked. And if you find it a bit distracting being able to look through the model, you can also choose to turn off that X-ray mode. So I'll click this here, and now I'm just seeing the front-facing edges of our 3D model. So if I press Tab to toggle between those two modes, you can see how our model is being affected by our decimation ratio. And it does look quite clean. It looks quite good. So I could use this as my decimate ratio. I could choose to go even further. Generally, with 3D models, I tend to recommend a ratio between 0.3 and 0.5, but this is a special case. I'm seeing that I'm still getting those nice smooth edges even when I have that decimation applied. So I could try going even lower to something like 0.05. And here you can see we're starting to get a bit of loss in the overall visual fidelity of our model. If I zoom in here, you can see we've got some quite harsh, jagged edges. And to give you a bit more of a visual look, I can choose to hide that wireframe. That'll just remove the visual noise and give you a look of how that's going to show up in the Jig workshop. Now, this is a bit harsh, and generally I do recommend looking for areas of the 3D model that have quite a high level of detail so that you can make sure you aren't losing that detail. So checking along these pieces here, checking along these edges here, and looking at your edge loops just to see how they have that detail applied. In this case, I'd probably back off the amount of decimation I applied, so I might go back to 0.1. And you can see already when I make that change, I can go Ctrl-Z and set that up again. Focus on this area here while I make that change. And you can see how smooth those rings are then becoming. So 0.1 is probably a good value in this case, so I'll apply this. And you can see that what initially was about 100,000 triangles has now gone down to 10,000. So when I reveal all my hidden objects, you can see that we've gone from a model that originally had a couple of hundred objects and originally had almost 200,000 triangles. We've now gone down to 32 and about 100,000. So this has been nicely optimized and it's about ready for the Jig workshop. But another feature I'd like to show you is our ability to add in Jig materials. If you have a 3D model that supports texture maps, in order for you to apply these in the Jig Blender template, you just need to select your model, and under the material menu, it's important to make sure you have the standard material selected. I'm then going to scroll down, and we have three options here. We have diffuse textures, RMA textures, and normal textures. So to start off with, we're going to bring in the color information. So I'll bring in our color map, and you can see that's applied our label to that 3D model. Next, I'll bring in our RMA texture. And now when I zoom in on this model, you can see that we have some nice roughness applied to the main model, but where we have our logo applied, we have some nice shine, and we also have a bit of metallic sheen applied to that shadow as well. And finally, we're going to add in our normal texture. This is going to provide our height information. So once I've applied this, you can see that when I zoom in, we've got a little bit of light happening on the edge of that logo that we have. So it's going to look as though it's been embossed onto that 3D model, like a sticker that's been applied to that model. So this can be a great way of applying decals and logos to your 3D model and making sure that they have that custom branding applied. In this example, we're going to be using the centrifugal pump model in order to explore some of the internal components that you may want to reveal inside of your jig. Now, in order for us to prep our 3D model for this process, I'm going to select all my objects. I could use select all objects up here, or I can press A. And what we're going to be working with is both our split menu and our target menu. And the reason we're keeping an eye on our target is in order to make sure that the model is as optimized as possible so that you're going to get the best performance when viewing the jig in augmented reality. Now, in order for us to do this, we've selected the iPhone, which is the weakest of the devices in this list. And we're going to be keeping our eye on the triangles and object count. Now, the reason we do this is when I select an axis to split my model on, in this case, we're working with the Y-axis, you can see how we're going to be splitting our model straight down the middle. So every single object that's a part of our selection is going to be a part of this split. So in order for me to perform that split, it is worth noting that we have this indicator, this green plane in our scene, and I'm able to offset where that plane is sitting in my space, in my workspace. If I press and hold Shift, I'm able to get a slower transition along that slice so that I'm able to get a bit more of a pinpoint accurate positioning. But in this case, I'm going to set it back to 0, as that will be the center point of all of our models that are currently selected. So that's a great way of getting a smooth cut right down the middle. So once I have my plane positioned in the scene, I'm then going to split my selected mesh. And you can see when I pull this apart and lift it up, that we now have both one side of our model fully split. We're also able to see inside the other half as well. So this is a great way for us to explore those internal components and discuss this inside of our presentation. But something worth noting, as a part of this process, when I select one of my objects again, you can see that we currently have 80 objects in our scene, and we've also mildly increased that triangle count. Now this is because we've basically doubled the number of objects by cutting all of those objects in half. So it is worth keeping an eye on that object target count in order to make sure that you aren't getting too much of a trade-off when you're performing these split actions. In this case, we aren't getting any warnings regarding the number of triangles or objects, so everything is still going to run nice and smoothly when you bring it into the Jig workshop. Now, if you want to edit an object's hierarchy inside of the Jig Blender template, you just need to open up the parenting menu, and this has the option to parent and clear parented objects. And as far as viewing the hierarchy goes, you just need to look in the outliner here. You can see we have a number of objects stepping down in this list, and each of those objects is parented in this hierarchy up that arm. Now, if I select a piece in this chain and rotate it, you can see how this parenting allows us to achieve more complex animations inside of the Jig workshop. Now, if I wanted to edit this hierarchy, I could select one of the pieces in this chain and I can clear that parent. Now, when I did this, you'll see that the object is removed from our chain and is added to the top of our stack here. Now this means that when I perform animations on the hierarchy as a whole, that object is no longer included as a part of that chain. If I wanted to add any objects to our hierarchy, I just need to select the child object and then select the parent object. And we're going to be parenting to the active object. Now, in this case, you can see which object is active based on the outline. So the orange outline represents an active object and the red outline represents one of those childs. So in this case, I'll parent. And this just means that that piece has now been re-added to our hierarchy and will be a part of those more complex animations. Now, if you have a 3D object that has no hierarchy applied, just as a quick example, I'll select my whole object and I'll clear our parenting. So you can see there's no longer any staggering. We have the object, we have the mesh, but none of these are parented. And what I tend to recommend is you start from the top down. It doesn't matter which direction you choose to go, this is just a preference of mine. So I'm going to select my child, select my parent, and parent to active. And I'm going to do this down the line of all the objects that make up our robotic arm. It can be a good idea to double check that your parenting is working as you go, just to make sure you've got no errors occurring while you're performing these operations. Now, one thing worth noting here when I parent these objects is I need to make sure that I'm getting all the objects on my model. If I do forget any pieces, like these black motors at the rear of our object, and if I perform some rotations, you can see that they aren't connected. So it's important to make sure you've got both of these selected when you're parenting those objects. And once you're done parenting this model and creating that hierarchy, when you export that model and bring it into the Jig workshop, that hierarchy is going to be available there. Now, if you don't want to perform any hierarchy changes, or if your model has no parenting, we have the ability to parent as well as edit those hierarchies inside of the Jig workshop as well. Once you've finished optimizing your 3D model, you can then go to the export menu, and in here we're going to select a root folder to save the model in. You'll then need to add in a file name, hit enter and export that GLTF file. You'll then get a little indicator that that was successful, and we can begin uploading this into the Jig workshop. So to do this, I'm going to open up the latest version of the Jig app. I'm then going to add in a new Jig, and I'll bring in my optimized robot arm. And you can see that all of those materials have been applied to our model. By swapping into sub-object mode and selecting our hinges, you can also see that we have that hierarchy applied to our 3D model. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also check that hierarchy by going to the left-hand menu and opening up our object list. You just need to open the drop-down and follow along that hierarchy here. So what I recommend doing next is saving your 3D model. So select the model, swap into object mode, which is our blue highlight. We're then going to go to the Add Content menu and we'll save this 3D object. Now, as well as being able to export your model, we also have the ability to upload a model straight to the Jig library using the Upload to Jig tool. Now for this, you'll need to enter your model's name, you'll need a certificate code, your user ID and the tenant ID. Now, if you don't have these details available, you can reach out to customer success and we'll be able to supply those for you. And in order to do this, I just need to upload to Jig, and that's going to save my 3D model into the team object library. So not only will I have access to this, now all of my colleagues will also be able to access this 3D model inside of that Jig library.